Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 8th, 2022. Let me begin by giving you a reminder that tomorrow, April 9th, will be an extraordinary Schiller Institute conference to convene an international conference to establish a new security and economic architecture. Now, this is increasingly urgent as the war in Ukraine is continuing. The efforts by the NATO alliance to destroy Russia are escalating. And of course, what's the whole point of this? It's to destroy Russia as an independent sovereign nation, which is making decisions that go against the demands of the so-called rules-based order. So you can get the link to the online conference. It starts at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And you can get the link at the schillerinstitute.com, and we'll post it at the bottom of today's update. Now, today I'm going to talk about the admission that's coming out of the use of disinformation in the campaign to destroy Russia. This was a fairly blatant report that came out in NBC and was covered by Caitlin Johnstone in her column. But I want to read you some quotes from this. Many of you know that disinformation, or better yet, lies, are being used to manipulate people to not only accepting a war against Russia, but accepting the consequences of that war, including hardships at home, high fuel prices, inflation. Now, those things have nothing to do with the war. They started before the war. But this is a cover to blame Putin. If you have a problem, blame Putin. If your garbage isn't picked up, blame Putin. If your cat's pregnant, blame Putin. That's the mentality. But listen to what NBC admitted. They did a report where they said they are deliberately spreading stories that they know to be, quote, low confidence, unquote, or, quote, based more on analysis than hard evidence, unquote. In other words, just plain false. NBC reported, and here's a quote from them, it was this is on the story that Russia was preparing to use chemical weapons, which was widely reported in the media. NBC said, quote, it was an attention-grabbing assertion that made headlines around the world. U.S. officials said they had indications suggesting Russia might be preparing to use chemical agents in Ukraine. President Joe Biden later said it publicly. But 3 U.S. officials told NBC News this week there is no evidence Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine. They said the U.S. released the information to deter Russia from using banned munitions, unquote. By the way, they did not report that the Russians destroyed all their chemical weapons in 2017, completing the process under the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, verifying that they destroyed them. Now then they had another example, a charge that Russia had turned to China for potential military help. This, quote, lacked hard evidence, a European official and 2 U.S. officials said. Quote, the U.S. officials said there are no indications China is considering providing weapons to Russia. The Biden administration put that out as a warning to China not to do so, unquote. And a third example was when they said that they have an intelligence report that Putin is being lied to by his advisors who are afraid to tell him the truth. NBC reports that this assessment, quote, wasn't conclusive. It was based more on analysis than hard evidence, unquote. Now keep in mind, at an Atlantic Council event in February, former MI6 chief John Sawyers said, the Biden administration is using releases of purported intelligence not to share an assessment, but to influence Putin's decisions. And NBC said, this is a break with the past, using intelligence to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intelligence isn't rock solid, unquote. How is that a break from the past? What about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? What about chemical weapons in Syria? This is the way the West fights its wars, lies and disinformation. Now, here's with all the fuss around Bucha, and there does need to be an investigation of what happened there. There are two very different stories, one from Ukraine and one from Russia. But the UN and the West is not going to allow an honest evaluation to take place because they're turning it over to the Ukrainian special prosecutor to investigate. Well, here's something the New York Times reported, hardly a pro-Russian paper. They have an article that talked about a video that they had posted showing Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian prisoners. This was released on April 4th. And the Times article said, "He's still alive. Look, he's still alive. He's gasping," a man says, as a Russian soldier with a jacket pulled over his head, apparently wounded, is seen still breathing. A soldier then shoots the man twice. After the man keeps moving, the soldier shoots him again, and he stops, unquote. Now, this apparently happened on March 30th, and there are other indications of similar executions. Now, interestingly, they report one of the soldiers saying, quote, "These are not even humans," unquote. That's the old Nazi line about Russians. They're subhuman. Same line the Nazis used about Jews. Now, interestingly, in reporting this, the Times never said there should be a further investigation of these events, while the Times and others are demanding that Russia be punished for the not yet investigated killings elsewhere that are alleged to be Russian war crimes. The argument is, we know Russia did it, we don't need to investigate. Now let me give you a few other headlines that just indicate the extent to which the West is being manipulated by this kind of intelligence warfare. Ukrainian President Zelensky appeared before the Greek parliament and gave a speech, his usual speech, about help us, we're victims, the Russians are killers and nasty, and we need all the help we can get. He was accompanied in this presentation by a member of the Azov battalion, the neo-Nazis embedded in the Ukrainian security forces. And he was identified as an Azov battalion member, although the parliament was told he was an ethnic Greek fighting the Russians. After he was exposed, the Greek government said his appearance was a mistake, but then attacked the people who exposed him. Not Zelensky, not attacking Zelensky, for allying himself with Nazis. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, the NATO foreign ministers met. They decided to provide more arms, more sanctions. Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said they must be, quote, prepared for the long haul. And this backs up what General Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said to the Congress the other day, quote, "This may last a long time, for many months, even years," unquote. That's just what the military-industrial complex wants to hear. That's music to their ears. More money for defense as the U.S. defense budget approaches $1 trillion a year. No money for infrastructure, no money for health care, but $1 trillion to provide weapons to Ukraine, weapons to NATO, redeploy forces all over the world, supposedly to defend democracy and freedom, which, as we've just seen from these reports from NBC News and the New York Times, it's not a clear-cut case of freedom versus authoritarianism. Now, in the sanctions, the new targets include Vladimir Putin's daughters. Also, 2 banks where the Russian people keep the majority of their savings. Obviously, this is an effort to squeeze the Russian population in the service of regime change in Russia. Now, the UN or the EU sanctions coordinator was exposed in a New York Times article, very interesting, as Bjorn Siebert, who's an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute for Defense Studies. This is one of the oldest British think tanks. It's the Royal Services Institute, or Royal United Services Institute. Why do you have a Brit, after Brexit, coordinating under Ursula von der Leyen the campaign for sanctions against Russia? The New York Times, in giving his biography, said that he spent much of his professional life immersed in the American defense ecosystem, kind of a polite way of saying in the military-industrial complex. He was the head of the planning staff for the German Defense Ministry when Ursula von der Leyen was German Defense Minister, and he followed her to Brussels to his new appointment. So again, the role of the Brits. And if you look for it, you can find new exposés, including from the Gray Zone, on how the BBC, which is the most blatant of the media disinformation or hybrid warfare operation, that the BBC is nothing but an arm of the British establishment, basically the City of London. So you can go to Gray Zone to get some of that. Now let me finish with what's happening on what used to be called the Indian subcontinent. The Indian government has maintained its neutrality, but is also working with Russia to have a rupee transaction arrangement so that they can buy Russian oil and gas with the rupee. Now they're under attack for this, but the Indians once again abstained when the U.S. put a motion to kick Russia out of the Human Rights Division of the UN, which by the way passed with 24 votes against it and another 20 or 30 nations abstaining. Now what's the response from the United States? Secretary of State Blinken is spending hours on the phone with Indian counterparts, threatening them or trying to convince them to drop the alliance with Russia. And the line is that from the sanctions coordinator, Singh, from the United States, that if India doesn't go along with the demands of the unipolar order, that there will be consequences, unquote. Now, there clearly were consequences in Pakistan yesterday, where the Supreme Court voted to overturn the dissolution of the parliament, opening the door for a vote of no confidence to throw out Prime Minister Imran Khan. What's his crime? Well, he's neutral in the East-West fight. He's working with China. He refuses to condemn Russia. He is not supporting sanctions. So the pro-U.S. forces in Pakistan are moving to oust him. Now, how do we know this? Well, again, let's go to the BBC. They had a report this morning which said that Singh is claiming without any evidence that there's a conspiracy run by the United States against him. What do you mean without evidence? Historically, the U.S. has intervened repeatedly in Pakistan, including pulling off a coup against Ali Bhutto in the late 70s and then having him hanged. Now, Khan has a memo from an ambassador, I believe the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, in which he said he was threatened that relations between Pakistan and the United States will not improve until Khan is gone. Is that a conspiracy theory to point that out? So once again, we see the use of intelligence as a weapon for regime change, in this case, not only in Russia, but in Pakistan, possibly in India. Now, that's why our conference is so important. Much of the world is rejecting this unipolar drive against Russia and against China, which threatens to engulf the world in a new world war that could easily go to nuclear weapons. This is not in anybody's interest, but it's being pushed by the forces in the so-called military-industrial complex, not just because they want money for arms, but because they're defending a financial system which is bankrupt and which is killing people all over the world. Now, I'll be moderating two of the panels at the conference tomorrow, the one on economics and the one on security. And you'll be able to hear from people from around the world, especially in the first panel, who are objecting to this unipolar order, continuing to assert the rules which are destroying nations and destroying populations, including in the West. So join us, register at the link that appears in the description box below. I hope I'll see you there tomorrow, and spread the word. We cannot allow this kind of information warfare, because what's the target of the information warfare? It's not Putin. Putin doesn't believe any of this crap. He knows better. It's you. It's your neighbors. It's an effort to convince them by spreading these lies they'll be helping the country. And instead, all it helps is the billionaires who are creating the lies to protect their financial interests. So thanks for joining me. Join me tomorrow with the Schiller Institute conference, and I'll see you then.